you a Christian?
No,
You're not. Do you believe in God?
I don't.
So are you an atheist?
I have an absence of belief in God. It's sort of like if we heard a noise in the back right now, I wouldn't say to you, that was probably an invisible purple hippopotamus. I have no evidence that that's what it is. I would say it's probably a noise caused by something we've seen, something we can prove, something there's evidence for. I wouldn't tell you invisible purple hippopotamuses don't exist or could never exist.
Right.
I just have no reason to think that that's what caused the noise.
The geologic column is actually the Bible for the evolutionist. The only place you'll ever find it is in the textbooks. It doesn't exist. This guy admits it. He said, if there were a column of sediments, unfortunately no such column exists. Did you know there is no geologic column? If there was, it'd be 100 miles thick. It doesn't exist. It's one of the lies in the textbooks, and actually all of evolution is based on this lie right here. This is one of the most serious ones, in my opinion. It's true the Earth has layers. That's not the question. Okay? How did they get there, though? I mean, if that layer sat there for 10 million years waiting for the next one, don't you think it's going to rain once in a while in 10 million years? Why are there no erosion marks between the layers? Why are they stacked on top of each other just like a stack of pancakes? And by the way, why are there no soil layers between the rock layers? I mean, soil builds up on top of rock. Don't you think there'd be some soil built up once in a while? The moon has craters on it, but we never see the moon get struck by anything. Where did these craters come from on the moon? Even Mercury has craters on it. Where did these craters come from? Mars has a canyon much larger than Grand Canyon. 4 of the planets today still have rings around them, and the rings around these planets are made of rock and ice. Very interesting. Now, Walt Brown thinks some of the craters on the moon were formed when the fountains of the deep broke open and rocks went flying up out of Earth's gravitational pull, drifted around for a while and clobbered into the moon. He thinks the comets came from Earth, and water on Mars came from Earth when the fountains of the deep broke open. Here's an article about a scientist who discovered chunks of ice as big as this auditorium are hitting the Earth all the time. They dissolve in space, but it rains down as water. There's water everywhere in space. Scientific and technology article here. The Bible says all the fountains of the deep were broken up in one day. If you smoothed out the Earth, the oceans right now would be 12,000 feet deep. Oceans average 12,000 feet deep. But if you smoothed out the Earth, they would average 8,000 feet deep everywhere. There's plenty of water on the Earth to cover the planet. When the climbers got to the top Mount Everest, 1953, the year I was born, they got up here on Mount Everest. They began to find something interesting. Petrified clams on top Mount Everest. In Peru a couple years ago, they found giant oysters up to 11 feet across, 2 miles above sea level. That's a big oyster. You should see the pearl. And these clams are interesting. I got some on the table down here. They're petrified clams in the closed position. Now think about it for a minute. When a clam dies, it opens. The muscle inside relaxes, the ligaments on the outside pull the shell open almost instantly. When a clam dies, it opens up. How would you get bazillions of petrified clams in the closed position on top of mountains all over the world? The best explanation for this is they were buried alive. Sometimes huge beds of these are found. A guy in Opp, Alabama said, "Brother Hovind, you want some petrified clams for a museum?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "They're 4 feet thick in my backyard." When he rototills his garden, he brings up thousands of petrified clams, closed petrified clams. Even fragile items like eggs are found fossilized. I believe the sediments would settle out of this flood. Fine sediments would preserve things in incredible detail. Here's a fossilized jellyfish. We have an arm to an octopus, fossilized octopus arm in our museum. Soft tissue simply doesn't fossilize. Under very special conditions are required. The Bible says the fountains of the deep broke open. So I think the earth got struck by a meteor. The water underneath went shooting to the surface, and the earth was covered with water. See, the earth's crust is kind of interesting. Pretty thin, actually, in some spots. 3 to 5 miles thick under the crust, under the oceans, and 30 miles thick under the continents. The hot water from inside the earth would come shooting out, and it would kill animals that live within a certain radius of the crack as the hot water escaped. As the basalt bulged up in the middle, the plates are going to slide down, explaining, as I said earlier, about the wrinkled mountains. Take a look at these mountains in British Columbia. They've been pressed from the end, wrinkled up. What happened? During the first few months of the flood, the dead animals would settle out. People ask, why aren't more human fossils found? Well, humans are smarter than animals. Some humans are, and some animals. And they would tend to avoid drowning till the last possible minute. Animals that are buried on top or very, very shallow soil are not going to fossilize. Think of all the millions of buffalo that were killed out west in the last few hundred years. None of them fossilized because they weren't buried. So fossils only form if an animal is buried pretty deeply and pretty quickly before it has time to decay. Marvin Lubenow says about 4,000 sets of human remains have been found. I think there are fewer humans than animals found fossilized because they were smarter and would avoid drowning till later in the flood, and therefore they're not going to be fossilized. We cover more on that in video 7. The trees that are uprooted would float around in big log mats the size of Texas. They're going to be buried and become the coal seams that we see today. Moving water does some very interesting phenomena. As water is moving, it automatically sorts things. It can form 5 or 6 layers simultaneously. There's a good videotape called Experiments in Stratification that shows the top strata can actually be older than the bottom strata. If the water's moving, it forms multiple layers simultaneously. During the flood, the water would be swirling around, and the dead animals would tend to, get caught in these little swirls called eddies. This happens today. If you walk along the river, you see the river moving one direction, but along the sides, there's little eddies swirling water. This would happen on a global scale during the flood of Noah. As the animals would float around for a few weeks, they would rot, and their head falls off, and tail falls off, and legs fall off. And when they finally get buried, you end up with tangled up messes of dinosaur bones. Notice these backbones here have no head attached, no legs, just the backbone.
Acquired characteristics gained after birth cannot be inherited. Large muscles acquired by a man in a weightlifting program cannot be inherited by his child, nor did giraffes get long necks because their ancestors stretched to reach high leaves. Stressful environments for some animals and plants cause their offspring to express various defense for the first time. New genetic traits are not acquired. Instead, certain environments can switch on genetic machinery already present. Amazingly, this optimal genetic machinery already exists to handle some contingencies, opposing the belief that time, the environment, or a need can produce the machinery. So if you give somebody antibiotics and then they quit taking the antibiotics too early, what happens is that the bacteria that are not resistant to the antibiotics all die, but the bacteria that can be resistant to the antibiotics will thrive and survive and begin to reproduce. Okay, so if you want to stop the infection, you have to keep taking the antibiotics so that all the bacteria are killed. Okay, so it's not that new bacteria are evolving that are resistant to the antibiotics. It's just that you didn't kill all of the bacteria. So there were some bacteria that were already resistant to the antibiotics in the colony of bacteria. Mendel's laws of genetics and their modern-day refinements explain almost all physical variations occurring within species. Mendel discovered that genes are merely reshuffled from one generation to another. Different combinations are formed, but not different genes. The different combinations produce many variations within each kind of life, as in the dog family. So when scientists made the poodle and the chihuahua and the pit bull and the Great Dane, they didn't create a new dog. They just took information that was already in the gene pool and selected it with artificial breeding. Like if you just select all of the different cows that are producing the most milk and you interbreed them, then you're going to get more cows that produce more milk. You have cows that can even jump, okay? So that's a strong cow that can jump, okay? It's got some strong legs, and those cows are produced by breeding certain cows with certain characteristics. But nobody created a new cow, okay? Nobody's going to create a new horse that can grow wings and fly around the Kentucky Derby track so you can win the race in 10 seconds. It is not possible. You cannot get a dog bigger than a house or smaller than a flea. There are limitations, and none of the information that you're using to produce a variation of the creature is new information. It's all pre-existing information that was originally uploaded into the cells of the creature. Organisms with the greatest number and the longest times should also, according to macroevolution, have the greatest potential for evolving new features and species, but microbes falsify this prediction as well. Their numbers per species are astronomical, and they are dispersed throughout all the world's environment. Even so, the number of species of the microbes is relatively few, so apparently those new features do not evolve. Organisms such as bacteria that quickly produce the most offspring should have the most variation and mutation. Literally, over 300 years, bacteria are among the fastest reproducing organisms in the world, doubling every 4 to 20 minutes. The bacteria Vibrio macroevolution, or major change in the structure and DNA of an animal, would require an upward change in the complexity of certain traits and organs. Microevolution, which is small change and variation, involves only horizontal or even downward changes with no increasing complexity, and that's actually all that we ever observe. Many drawings have been made to show the intermediates in between a bird and a dinosaur, or an ape and a human, but none have actually been observed. Like so many terms in science, the popular meaning of natural selection differs from what the word actually means. Selecting implies something that nature cannot do, think, make decisions, or make choices. Instead, the complex genetics of each species allow variations within a species. In changing environments, those variations give some members of a species a slightly better chance to reproduce than other members, so their offspring have a better chance of surviving. The marvel is not about some capability that nature does not have, but about the designer who designed for adaptability and survivability in changing environments. Mutations are the only known means by which new genetic material becomes available for possible evolution into new traits. Rarely, if ever, is a mutation beneficial to an organism in its natural environment. Almost all observable mutations are harmful, meaningless, or fatal. No known mutation has ever produced a form of life with greater complexity and viability than its ancestors. Dr. John Stanford has shown that mutations occur at such a rapid rate that the mutational meltdown would have occurred in humans in 100,000 years. Genetic entropy is pushing mankind toward extinction, and according to the data, we should have already been extinct. All species appear fully developed, not partly developed. They show design. There are no examples of half-developed feathers, eyes, skin tubes, arteries, veins, intestines, or any vital organs, dozens in humans alone. Tubes that are not 100% complete are a liability, so are partially developed organs and some body parts. For example, if a leg of a reptile were to evolve into a wing of a bird, it would become a bad leg long before it became a good wing. Human trainers have taught some gorillas and chimpanzees to recognize a few hundred spoken words, to point up to 200 symbols, and to make limited hand signs. Wild apes have not shown these vocabulary skills, and trained apes do not pass their vocabulary on to others. When a trained animal dies, so does the trainer's investment. If language evolved, the earliest languages should be the simplest, but language studies show that the more ancient the language, the more complex it is. That is, they became simpler instead of more complex. Most linguists reject the idea that simple languages evolve into complex languages. If humans evolved, then so did language. All available evidence indicate that language did not evolve, so humans probably did not evolve. It is illogical to maintain that similarities between different forms of life always imply a common ancestor. Such similarities may imply a common designer and show efficient design. In fact, where similar structures are known to be controlled by different genes or developed from different parts of embryos, a common designer is a much more likely explanation than evolution. Since 1868, evolutionists have taught that developing embryos pass through stages that mimic an evolutionary sequence. In other words, in a few weeks, an unborn human repeats the stages that supposedly took evolution millions of years to evolve humans from apes. A well-known example is the gill slits that are supposedly on the embryos of humans in the early stages of development. But those gill slits are not gills at all. They are just folds in the skin that are used to produce various glands in the eyes, ears, nose, and throat. Embryologists no longer consider the superficial similarities between a few embryos and the adult forms of simpler animals as evidence for evolution. Ernst Haeckel, by deliberately falsifying his drawings, originated and popularized this incorrect but widespread belief. Many modern textbooks continue to spread this false idea as evidence for evolution. Spontaneous generation, the emergence of life from non-living matter, has never been observed.
They tell him this is how they made life in the laboratory. He had methane, ammonia, water vapor, and hydrogen, no oxygen. He circulated these gases through these tubes through a spark, supposed to represent lightning. And sure enough, it produced a red goo at the bottom of the flask and had some amino acids in it.
This article from Scientific American entitled The Origin of Life on Earth says it's virtually impossible to imagine how a cell's machines could have formed spontaneously from non-living matter around 3.7 billion years ago. Notice the vocabulary that the article is using. You can't even imagine it, is what it's saying. The Miller and Urey experiment of the University of Chicago in the 1950s showed that simple chemicals such as proteins and amino acids are easy to form, but going from there to proteins and enzymes is a completely different story.
They didn't come close to getting life, though. Miller excluded oxygen in a reducing atmosphere because life could not evolve with oxygen. Anything that got together would oxidize. Cut a banana open, lay it on the table, it'll turn brown, it'll oxidize. Okay, so will an apple, so will anything alive. It'll oxidize. So that's why he didn't have any oxygen in the experiment. One of his gases was ammonia. Well, this creates a real serious problem because ammonia is destroyed by UV light. And UV light must be blocked by ozone, which is made from oxygen. Ozone is made from oxygen and it blocks UV light, and ammonia, one of the gases needed for the experiment, is destroyed by UV light. So life cannot evolve without oxygen. But also life cannot evolve with oxygen. Well, I got a solution for that one. It didn't evolve.
So you got the basic molecules for life, the organic compounds, but that's like having all the pieces to a puzzle. If you don't have them in the right order, it does you no good, and there's no idea about even the first step of how these organic molecules are organizing themselves and replicating. All observation has shown that life comes only from life. This has been observed so consistently, it's called the law of biogenesis. The theory of evolution conflicts with this scientific law when claiming that life came from non-living matter through natural processes. Evolutionary scientists reluctantly accept the law of biogenesis. However, some say that future studies may show how life could come from lifeless matter despite virtually impossible odds. Others are aware of just how complex life is and the many failed and foolish attempts to explain how life came from non-life. Nature Journal, 2019, the new physics needed to probe the origins of life. No one has led the charge on the questions of the origin of life, like Stuart Kaufman, it says. His key insight is motivated by what he calls the non-ergodic world, that of objects more complex than atoms. This article is saying that the origin of life started from an unknown physics, meaning complex atoms. They did not look like they look today, but there's no experimentation for these complex atoms. Nature Journal says that the theory of complex atoms is basically the structure of the electrons and the protons and neutrons within the nucleus of an atom. According to the Nuclear Information Center, the simplest element on the periodic table, hydrogen, is made of 0 neutrons, 1 proton, and 1 electron. The more complex an element, the more neutrons, protons, and electrons an atom will contain. So complex atoms are atoms that have an excess of electrons and neutrons. And when you study those electrons and neutrons, then you can have a better understanding of the complex atom. We know that protons and neutrons within a nucleus of an atom consist of quarks. When you get an atom hot enough through a particle accelerator, colliding particles together and creating fireballs, the droplets created cool too quickly to study directly. The challenge is to peer through the debris to glimpse the signature of the little bangs. So you have a quark soup that is surrounded by nuclear debris of photons and protons and free electrons, and you can't see what the quark soup is doing when it cools. We've seen boiling water, it says in this article by CERN, but we do not yet know what steam looks like nor how the boiling goes. So they don't know what exactly is happening when the quark soup is cooling because of all the surrounding debris. Now, recent experiments in 2022 have shown that it is producing mainly quarks at different charges than were initially present in the quark soup. So the quarks that make up the protons and neutrons consist of 6 different charges. They are bound together by the force carriers. The bosons, the gluons, and the photons all work together to combine the quarks into protons and neutrons. And then the electrons, which are specifically referred to as leptons, have 6 different charges. So then the claim is, if we understood exactly how protons, neutrons, and electrons are forming from the initial conditions of a quark soup, then we'd be able to understand how life spontaneously was generated from inanimate dead matter. No one knows what the process of a cooling quark soup even looks like. Nature Journal 2015, Origins of Life, An Improbable Journey. It says, as elegant as the details underpinning the thesis seem, it is occasionally hard to distinguish between fact and speculation. We don't know if this is how it actually happened or if we're just speculating. Nature Journal 2008, still clueless about the origin of life. Ashwini Kumar examined over 60 relevant research papers and concluded that science has no clue about how life began. Physics.org 2024, The Improbable Origins of Life on Earth, says, we do not yet know how, where, or why life first appeared on our planet. Part of the difficulty is that life has no strict, universally agreed upon definition. So let me ask you this, if they can't even define life, how much do you think that they actually know about how it began? Astrobiology 2024, The Potential Origins of Life in Ancient Hot Springs. We think that this research may provide the first step in how life originated on our planet. This article is saying that we haven't even reached the first step of getting these organic compounds assembled into simple machines. ScienceFocus.com says that the short answer to the emergence of life is that we don't know. Scientists could put the right chemicals in a sealed container under the correct conditions, and when they opened it, they'd find living organisms. HMS investigators at Massachusetts General Hospital have accomplished an important step toward their goal of creating primitive synthetic cells. The protocells they are building consist of a nucleic acid strand encased within a membrane-bound compartment. So here's the question. Where did they get the nucleic acid strands and the membrane-bound compartments? Did they just construct them from scratch? Or did they use something like a bacteria that's already alive and take different parts from it to be able to construct the nucleic acid strands and the membrane compartment? This article says that scientists led by the University of Bristol have created synthetic cells known as protocells using viscous microdroplets filled with living bacteria as a microscopic building site. So if you weren't familiar with the understanding of basic synthetic biology, you would think that they constructed the protocells from non-living matter from scratch, but they did not. They used a vial filled with living bacteria to do it. According to the National Center for Biotechnology Information, in an article entitled The Principles of Synthetic Biology, they say that synthetic biology is biological cells and processes that are dismantled and reassembled to make novel systems that do useful things. The National Human Genome Research Institute says that synthetic biology is a field of science that involves redesigning organisms for useful purposes. Now, if you know how the information on Google and the internet works, they extract the information from the existing scientific articles to post a general inquiry to issues. Okay, so Wikipedia says synthetic biology is a multidisciplinary field of science that focuses on living systems and organisms, and it applies engineering principles to them. Nature Journal says that synthetic biology uses unnatural molecules to reproduce emergent behaviors from natural biology. Now, they're claiming to have been able to do this. So the question is, what is an unnatural molecule? Berkeley, the University of California, in an article entitled Synthetic Biology Moves into the Realm of the Unnatural, will tell us what an unnatural biology is. It says that researchers could engineer a microbe to produce something unknown in nature. So they took natural biology, natural living cells, they took individual parts from them and made something that creates something that natural cells do not create. So now we can understand what unnatural biology is. It is a replicating system of organization that is not found in nature. But in order to get it, in order to construct a primitive cell or a proto-cell from that, you still need a modern cell. So without the modern cell, there is no experimentation on proto-cells. Case closed, you can't get life from non-life still yet. Bertrand Russell, who is a British mathematician and philosopher, said that organic life, we are told, has developed gradually from the protozoan to the philosopher. Unfortunately, it is the philosopher, not the protozoan, who gives us this assurance. Fred Hoyle, the English astronomer who formulated the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, said, "In short, there is not a shred of objective evidence to support the hypothesis that life began in an inorganic soup here on Earth." He said the chance that higher life forms might have emerged through evolutionary processes is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the material therein. Harold Urey, who is a physical chemist who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of deuterium, said, "All of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We all believe as an article of faith that life evolved from dead matter on this planet. It is just that life's complexity is so great it is hard for us to imagine that it did." Paul Davies, an English physicist and writer, professor in Arizona State University and director of Beyond, the Center for Fundamental Concepts in Science, said that the origin of life is one of the great outstanding mysteries of science. The most famous cosmologist probably of all time, Neil deGrasse Tyson, said, "One of the most significant events in our distant past is still perhaps the greatest mystery, the origin of life itself."